Sure.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Robin Ledbetter, and you are in the right place if you are here to Take Care of Yourself, the Introduction to Trauma Journalism in the Workplace. And I welcome you on behalf of the Ethics Center of Journalism over in Kimball Hall and the Walter J. Limpy Department of Journalism. We've got several distinguished panelists here today to talk about our topic. The first is Mr. David Handschuh. He is a distinguished visiting professor of ethics. He has a deep history within photography and working as a journalist, so he brings a wealth of knowledge today. Erica Gamboa, she's director of the Veterans Resource Center. April Rand, she is a social work professor here at the university. Matthew Feldner, a psychology professor and director of the Intervention Sciences. And last but certainly not least, Mr. Ray McCaffrey. He's director of Center of Ethics and Journalism. And I'm going to turn it over to Ray to get started.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Most importantly, Bobby Foster, our assistant director, and Christy Walter, our graduate assistant, are in the back of the room, and they're overseeing schedules, sign-in sheets, and also getting people to move up. So move up.
There are plenty of seats.
Yeah. Okay, so what we're doing today is talking about a subject that is always with us, doesn't go away. All you have to do is look at what happened at Oklahoma State over the weekend. As David would say, sometimes beautiful mornings can turn into hellish events. And if you're going to be a journalist, you will find yourself at one point asking people about pumpkins and beautiful things, and the next thing you know, a car comes careening through a crowd, and you're dealing with traumatized people, and guess what? You're probably going to be one of them. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And hopefully it'll help you if you become a journalist, but it should help you as a person. This may be the only time or one of the few times we get to talk about this. So we have some experts who are going to share some knowledge and think of some good questions, okay? Because this is a really important subject, and we want to hear from you guys too.
Well, some of the topics that we're going to explore, and forgive me as I sit, would it be better if I stood? We all have to take turns standing.
I think too early. I think we're good.
Okay. We're going to talk about some of the things that they're going to discuss and explain a little bit more thoroughly is what is trauma, what does trauma look like, how do you recognize trauma, whether you're normal or abnormal, and does your background affect your coverage as a journalist? So you're going to hear from the experts on our panel, and it's a really unique and interesting setting, I think, for all of us. So would any of you like to start talking about what is trauma, and how would you define that for our students that are here?
Sure, I could start us off. So when we talk about trauma, and I'm sort of approaching this from the clinical psychology field, we're talking about events. And usually the events are characterized by a lot of threat to yourself, threat to someone else. They can take a lot of forms. It can be motor vehicle accidents, natural disasters, combat, physical or sexual assault. So there's a lot of things that can fall into this general category of traumatic events. Right off the bat, I want to separate it from how people respond to trauma, because I think that's a big piece of what we're thinking about today. A lot of people experience some sort of trauma, 60 to 80%, depending on the estimates that you might be looking at. But most people go on to experience some symptoms in the short term after experiencing a traumatic event and recover. It's that minority of people that don't recover from that acute symptomatic response that might be labeled PTSD, which I think we'll be talking about too, or post-traumatic stress disorder. So in short, a trauma is just an event that happens to us, it's threatening, happens to us, or maybe we see it happen to someone else, or we're dealing with the after effects of it. There's a literature on first responders who might be handling human remains in a disaster, for example, or a car accident or combat that can really impact people as well. So that's kind of an overview of traumatic events and then that post-traumatic response.
Did you have something?
Yeah, I think too it's important to point out this concept of secondary trauma or vicarious trauma. So for example, in the field of social work, we're constantly interacting with clients who maybe have experienced trauma, victimization, and just by working with them, sometimes we become traumatized ourselves. And so I think you as a journalist, you may not exactly come into contact with a difficult event, but the idea of covering multiple traumatic events or interacting with people sometimes influences you and you become impacted by secondary trauma. So I think that's an important concept to have on your mind, that you may not yourself experience the event, but by covering those events, interacting with folks, you yourself may experience secondary trauma.
As Ray mentioned about the recent, the terrible tragedy that happened over the weekend at Oklahoma State. So I think that's probably hits home for some of you, especially with homecoming happening here, upcoming this weekend. So if you guys could elaborate, what does trauma look like? Because that's a pretty huge thing that happened over the weekend. But what are some other examples, or what could trauma look like?
Well, in military settings, of course, the first thing that a lot of people think is combat or war or anything like that. But it could look like anything that just really stops you for a minute, and you are out of the space of what's going on. You're outside looking in, and it stops you for a minute, trying to figure out what's going on. So I think trauma can look like anything. It's unexpected. It just gives you a feeling of complete emotion, like not understanding what your emotions are at that time.
And journalism today is fraught with little gremlins waiting in the shadows to attack, whether it's from inside the newsroom, where if you actually have a staff job, wondering if you're going to still have that staff job tomorrow, next week, or a month from now. If you're a freelancer, wondering if your clients are going to stop calling. And that's before we even go out and cover the news. And it's not just the really big scary stories like cars into crowds or the World Trade Center or Iraq, Afghanistan. It's the daily journalism. It's the repeated contact with people who are in traumatic situations. If you're the newbie in the newsroom, if you're the rookie reporter, you're probably going to be covering courts and cops. And you're going to be witness to testimony at a trial that's incredibly powerful, often with crime scene photos that don't just leave you right away. Or if you're out there in the streets, you're going to be covering the car accidents and the fires day after day after day. It's a minefield of trauma waiting to happen, and you have to know that there are resources for you to help yourself and to help others in the field.
Some other examples of traumatic events, some relatively common ones, would be the natural disasters, tornadoes, being in an earthquake. And I think we mentioned emotion during these events. I think it's those folks who experience a lot of fear in these situations where it can have a lasting impact. Car accidents is a common one. Some of the most toxic can be the interpersonal traumatic events. So sexual assaults, physical assaults, child abuse, combat, where there's something about that interpersonal nature that tends to linger for people and cause them a little more distress for a little bit longer. Those would be a few more examples.
So once you identify what trauma is, how do you recognize that you're normal or abnormal?
One thing I like to do is visualize. I like to have everything visual. I like to see what my day looks like. So I'll write down my events up throughout the day, and if something in there does not look like a normal to me, then I know I need to step back and look at what's going on and realize, hey, I need to maybe take care of this before I move over to whatever next item I'm doing or the next day. So for me, it's a visual thing, just knowing what my normal is and what my abnormal is.
Yeah, and I think for me, I did a lot of rape crisis work. So I was working with women who experienced sexual assault, sexual abuse, and then as a researcher, I worked with women in the sex trade. So they were talking to me about their experiences in the sex trade, really horrific stories of violence, abuse. I mean, things that you just cannot even imagine would happen to a group of people. And I know for me, I recognized the abnormal fairly quickly because I started to have nightmares. So I'd be going to bed and then I would start to actually visualize these women's stories. I found myself really not being able to sleep, feeling really intensely emotional. So after I would interview a woman, I would be driving back to campus and I would cry. I mean, it was just taking such an emotional toll on me. I also became really hypervigilant. So I was aware of all this violence happening in this city that I lived in. So I would drive by a hospital and I would say, wow, that's where most women go when they're sexually assaulted. And that's not a normal way of seeing the world that you live in. So I think for me, I recognized that those were signs of that secondary trauma, and that for me, I needed to really talk to someone about that, because you can't keep moving forward in this state of being highly alert. When you find yourself not being able to sleep, not eating normally, stopped exercising, things that were really normal to me. So I think when you start to see those signs, it's really important to recognize them and then not just brush them under the table. Because here I was someone who had a lot of experience working with these populations, and even I was impacted by these stories that I heard as a social worker. And we are trained to do this job. So you can imagine, as a journalist, you may experience those same symptoms of secondary trauma.
I think that was really well said. You kind of can get caught in your head.
Mm-hmm.
You can have nightmares about it, have problems not thinking about it, the event, whatever it is, or the repeated events like we've mentioned, pops up when you don't want it to. You might maybe taking a test, for example, and there's an unwanted memory of whatever it was that happened. I think one piece I'd add that sort of helps identify if there's lingering problems is you're having problems functioning somewhere. Maybe it's in relationships. You're feeling a little bit short, a little bit irritable, and it's having an impact with family or friends. Maybe it's functioning in your job as a reporter at school. But once that impairment starts creeping in, I would say that's when it's really time to pay close attention to what you might need to do on your own to feel a bit better. And I think we're going to talk a bit more about that. Or if you want to talk to someone else about it, be it a professional or a friend.
How does your background, your personal background, the way you grew up or experiences that you've had personally affect your coverage of things? David, how has that affected you?
You know, the general rule was that the longer you do it, the easier it becomes. You become desensitized to the tears and the blood and the broken bodies. But for myself, I found just the opposite, that the level of empathy for the people who I covered increased. My own angst over going and doing it increased. And I think as a reporter, we can't ever lose that ability to feel for the people we're talking to. In fact, that's what compels us to do better journalism. I'd say if you're not feeling and you're not worried about what's happened to the people we're talking to, then we're in the wrong business. So for myself, it did not get easier.
Something, if you guys would, talk about the stigma of trauma and mental health, especially in journalism, or just as a society as a whole.
A lot of individuals think of mental health as you have to be diagnosed for something. You have to have the big diagnosis like schizophrenia, bipolar, dealing with any of these type of disorders. But mental health is actually, to me, it's not that. It's just any time that you're having some type of transition, some transitional difficulty, such as you need to get an 85 on an exam to pass a class. Anything that builds any anxiety, and you want to talk to someone and release that out, that's mental health, is taking care of yourself, learning about your emotions, learning that there is time to ask someone for help. And mental health can help you in the sense to where the individual listening to you keeps your information confidential. So it's someone that you can build a relationship with and give out all those emotions that you lock inside of yourself and release them out so that they don't build up.
Often there's this idea that to go to a mental health professional, I need to be broken. Or if I go to a mental health professional, that must mean I'm broken in some way. I can't handle it. I should be able to handle this on my own. I'm tough enough to deal with this. And it's that belief really can influence how likely people are to just go and talk to someone and get some ideas about how to handle things a bit better. I think it plays a big role in stigma. Mental health is only for the people who are dealing with psychosis. And the field's really working to get past that stigma in a lot of areas. The military is a big one, where coming back and going and seeking help kind of goes against the training in a lot of ways. That you need to be tough, you need to be independent, you need to be, trained and prepared to deal with whatever comes your way. And so we're trying to educate everyone we can about that you can go seek treatment. It doesn't mean you're broken.
And the newsroom mentality seems to replicate that of soldiers and first responders. That there's the fear in the newsroom, if you raise your hand and say, I don't want to go out and cover that story. Well, today they'll let you slide, but tomorrow they'll take you off of the front page story, or they'll take you off of the A-team, and nobody wants to be taken off of the A-team. You have to identify somebody in the newsroom who you're comfortable with talking to, and hopefully friends and family are supportive also. But there's nothing wrong with raising your hand and saying, doing these kinds of stories isn't working for me emotionally.
And I think it's important in journalism to create a culture where it's okay to say that. And I think by having these conversations and really reaching folks who are going to be new in the field, you have this information, and when you see a fellow reporter struggling, reaching out to that person and saying, it's okay to ask for help. I think we can change the culture of journalism by having these conversations and recognizing the challenges you will experience and how they're going to impact your mental health and wellness. I think in social work, we have these conversations all the time. We really preach self-care. But that's not to say that we don't get overloaded with high caseloads, working after hours, and being on call. I mean, it's a very similar dynamic, with the exception that we do preach taking care of ourselves, seeking out a supervisor weekly to talk about your experiences. And it seems that journalism needs to shift that way to some extent.
Well, another challenge that journalists are facing today is I call the great digital divide. Photographers used to come into the office, process our film, look at it at a light table with other photographers and other editors. But now you're the photographer, you're the editor, and you're sending your pictures remotely. You're sending them from your car, you're sending them from your house, you're sending them from out in the field, and rarely do you have the opportunity to sit around that light table and talk about things with other journalists. So we need to make the opportunities available to talk with each other, to find each other. And if I know that you've been on a bad car crash, if I know that you're covering a tough story, it's up to me as your peer and your coworker, your friend, to go out and find you. Hey, let's go out for beer. Let's go out and sit down. You okay? Just asking you okay might open the door for a very, very important discussion.
I think these are really important points. One of the biggest predictors of who recovers successfully from traumatization is social support. And this divide, this increasing isolation, really needs to be taken seriously, because it's removing the biggest resource that you have to recover from the traumatic event. And I think the idea of thinking of it as a culture is a really good one. We need to know when we're not recovering all that well, and we need to talk to somebody, but we can also offer assistance as colleagues, offer understanding as employers. There's a lot of ways we can make sure that the group we're working with is as healthy as possible when encountering these highly stressful and traumatic incidents.
You used the word numb earlier. The journalists experience it after repeated coverage events. And how is it tied to trauma and self-care?
I think we have to realize that these are very normal responses to very not normal situations that we're seeing day after day after day. We have to allow ourselves to feel not only empathy for the people we're interviewing, but for ourselves. I think if you find yourself drifting off and, making jokes about something horrible is a normal way of coping. But if that's your actual belief that you take home with you, then I think that's a big red flag for me that you don't have to chat with somebody, whether it's a clergy member, whether it's somebody in my newsroom, whether it's somebody, I used to talk to lots of cops and firefighters. We went through the same things, I was taking pictures, they were rescuing people, but we were at the same events. And they have a wonderful means of coping. They joke about it, then they go back to the firehouse, or they go back to the police station, and everybody has the opportunity to talk with each other. So I think we have to do something similar.
And I think you're right that when you start to feel numb, that's not normal. And often social workers will experience that. They become really numb from the day to day. Almost the violence and the trauma that they hear about, or even in some ways witness, becomes normalized. And we don't want it to be normalized. And so I feel like if you find that happening to you, that is, again, a good warning sign to take a step back and think about what's going on in your life. And that you probably need to practice some self-care or even, take a break. So for example, I realized that things were getting really difficult. I was getting very normalized when I was answering the crisis line and responding to people who experienced sexual assault. And I had to make a professional decision that I couldn't do that work anymore. Because in order to be the best social worker you can be, the best journalist you can be, you have to be healthy. And you're going to be a better reporter if you're able to take care of yourself and approach others with empathy and respect for their experiences. So I really think it goes both ways, and it makes you a better professional, and that's always something to consider, because that's what you should ultimately be striving for, and you're going to get the better story if you approach it in the best way possible.
This might be an opportunity to mention that people respond to trauma in very different ways, too. Some folks might experience this kind of numbing. Some folks might get sad, anxious, depressed, whereas others get very irritable, very aggressive, even violent. And so there isn't one profile that's going to trigger a warning signal for anybody. I think it comes back to that idea of, is your response getting in the way? And numbing is a big predictor. If someone kind of dissociates from the event, from some of their life after the event, or finds themselves flashing back. I mean, these are big predictors of difficulty recovering, but they're not the only predictors.
How do they seek help? What are some ways that even student journalists that might be covering something that is traumatic, how can they seek help? What do they do?
Well, as students, you all have access to CAVS and the Psychological Center here on campus. So you have some resources on campus. If y'all are under insurances, then you can receive some care outside of the institution. So there's organizations here within campus. I'm sure there's some organizations that David spoke about in other outside that are specifically targeted towards journalist individuals.
I think my go-to resource for information to start off with is the DART, D-A-R-T, the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, currently up at Columbia University. And there's educational materials, there are stories from the front. There's, I'm not sure if they're still doing referrals or not, but that's, through the online presence of DART, I think that's a last resort. But as an information site, it's top-notch. It's a great place to start.
I know it helped me when I was conducting my research with women in the sex trade. I had a trusted advisor, and I think debriefing with her, so I would do actually a weekly debriefing because I was interviewing multiple women every week, and I mean that layers on you mentally, and so every week we would debrief the stories I was hearing. She listened, she didn't respond with judgment. And I think that's really helpful to have. And it doesn't have to be someone formally. It could be a trusted friend, colleague, supervisor, just someone who's going to lend an open, non-judgmental ear and be there when you need it. Because I think just talking about it can be really therapeutic within itself.
Yeah, absolutely. There's pretty decent talk therapies for problems related to trauma as well, with pretty good evidence. One thing I'd recommend is just make sure if you were to go get services or a friend of yours, just make sure there's evidence supporting it, because there's also a lot of stuff being done in the field that doesn't have the evidence in support of it. But there are very good evidence-based therapies. Medications can work pretty well also if people are interested in medications. But I want to come back to the point about even before going and getting treatment, there are things that people can do. Sleep is a huge one. Just making sure that you're on a healthy sleep routine can go a long ways. Staying away from unhealthy responses like drinking to forget about it, real common one. Or using other drugs. You can't get this out of your head, you can't get to sleep, so you have a bunch of drinks every night to deal with it, and that just compounds the problem, and obviously doesn't help get rid of the problem that's leading to the difficulties. So staying away from drinking, seeking that social support, making sure the sleep is okay, are all great things that a person can do, even if they want to put off going to seek more formalized treatment.
We're teaching students how to approach people, get them to interview them, get information for stories. So adding trauma to the mix is a whole other ball of wax, and adding a complication to what they're already beginning to learn. What are the ethical issues involved with interviewing trauma victims that might come up?
I think it's no longer acceptable to take a microphone, stick it in somebody's face and say, tell me how you're feeling, or what happened here. Has anybody had to go walk down a driveway and knock on a door yet and interview somebody who's just suffered a traumatic loss? Okay, it is the toughest thing to do in all of journalism. And I'm not a very religious person, but I used to pray that they weren't home because I hated doing the dreaded door knock. And you're going to have to do that day after day after day as the new reporter in the newsroom. And all I can tell you is that people don't have to talk to you. You'd like them to talk to you. You can ask them politely if they'd like to share some time with you. Accepting no has to be part of your way of doing business. And what's scary is how much of our motivation is to get that story is the competition that's out there. The greatest fear about doing that dreaded door knock is they'll slam the door in your face but talk to Channel 4. And there's nothing worse than coming back and having your news director or your boss or your editor say, why did they talk to the Daily Town the Town Tattler Gazette, but they didn't talk to you? You know, it's tough. But I think just being understanding of the people who are in very, very tough position, some people will want to talk to you. Some people are honored that you're spending the time to tell the story of their loved one. Other people blame you for what happened. Often, every range of emotions will go, you'll go through every range of emotions with your subject in the 10 or 15 minutes you get to talk with them. So just be empathetic. Again, that's it keeps coming up, I think, in our discussions. But, you know, you got to be respectful. If they say that they don't want to talk, they don't want to talk. And then hope that they're not talking to your competition.
And I think it's really important to educate yourself about the populations you will potentially be interviewing. I get a lot of students and a lot of people coming to me saying, well, I want to, interview a victim of human trafficking, or I want to interview a woman who's been in the sex trade, and I have to look at them and say, well, do you know anything about that population? Have you ever had any experience with, because it's, again, you can experience a wide range of emotions when talking to these women. We laughed, we cried. I unfortunately uncovered, some childhood traumatic experiences when I was talking to them about their life, where they were breaking down, crying, disclosing histories of abuse that they hadn't talked about in 10 years. So I always tell my students, if you want to interview this population, I really encourage you to educate yourself. Make sure that you have the skill and appropriate knowledge to be able to approach them with empathy, to handle someone who is going to have a breakdown right in front of you. Because there's been a lot of exploitive behavior with this population, people writing really sensationalistic pieces that are not backed by any evidence. At the agency I was working with, reporters wanted to come in and just look at the women and film them. And that is not appropriate behavior because it's a really hot topic. People want to get that story. So I think from my personal experience in my population, if that's your area of interest, or really anyone who's experienced a form of trauma and victimization, to prepare yourself with some background knowledge and knowing how to approach them with empathy, how to approach them in a trauma-informed way, because you have no idea how they're going to react or what you're going to uncover just by asking them a simple question. And I think for me, I was trained in that, but I still, again, had those really visceral, emotional reactions that I had to be prepared for. But if you do it right, you get really great information. And in my situation, at the end, a lot of them thanked me. They said, you're the first person who has ever listened to me. You're the first person who didn't look at me like I was crazy. Thank you for not looking shocked when I told you these really horrific stories about my experiences on the street. So you have to be careful about your verbal, but again, also that nonverbal body language, because folks will pick up on that and react.
I think sometimes too, giving them questions ahead of time so they can think about if they want to really answer those questions. And a lot of time, what you can find is that you can have all the questions that you need answered, and they may say, no, I don't want to talk about it, but when they you start interviewing them, they'll release that information to you. So it's giving them a moment to have the knowledge of what they're going to be asked so they can be prepared.
Erica, we often have students that ask to, or doing stories about the Veterans Resource Center, or seeking out a veteran that they could talk to about something in some sort of story. What are some tips or things that you have advice for students to hear on to whether what's the best way to approach it? If should they come through your office, or even what are some suggestions you have for them to talk when they're seeking out information from a veteran?
Normally students, journalist students will come through my office and ask, I need to speak to a veteran or veterans. And we always have to have the students, what the story's about, what the questions are about, and then we provide that information to our students because we do not release information on who student veterans are on campus. We let the students pick if they want to get interviewed or not. So I think starting with our office is the best way to do it. Like I said, getting those questions and having a little bit of knowledge, like she said, having a little bit of knowledge of what your story is about, what you're going to ask. If you're just going to go in there and say, I have this topic I need to cover, just because my assignment is due tomorrow or next week, know a little bit of knowledge. I know it takes some time, and I know you all are busy with other classes, but it will help you get your story across.
I think along the ethical lines, another thing to be really careful about is making sure, and I'm not sure the language of the ethics code in journalism, I'm more familiar with the psychological ethics code, but there's a heavy emphasis on informed consent in everything we do, making sure our clients or our research participants know exactly what's going on and what's going to be done with the information you gather, and what limits there might be to things like confidentiality. When interviewing someone who's just experienced a traumatic event, keep in mind all these symptoms of trauma we've been talking about: the distress, the anxiety, the fear, maybe the disgust, the sort of reliving the event in one's mind. That these things are all going to distract this person you want to interview from what you're saying. And so I think being extra cautious to make sure they understand what you're doing and what you're going to do with the information you get would be really important. I think also there's a flip. We talk about the ethical cautions, but also the good that can be done in interviewing people in the aftermath of a trauma or a disaster, to get word out about things like resources being made available, organizations that are helping, giving these other survivors that are seeing the report information is an ethical mandate almost. I mean, doing that much good, I think, is worth going through all of the cautions to make sure you do it well, but it can do so much good.
Talk about how the differences between interviewing children versus parents in a traumatic situation. How do you approach that differently, or what are some things that you think should know?
One piece, I guess, since we just mentioned informed consent, would be making sure the parents are consenting to interview the child. And so I'm thinking of some of the recent school shootings. The child may have experienced that directly. That doesn't mean the parent isn't feeling the effects of a traumatic event as well. And so being careful with both the child and the parent to make sure they know what's going on would be really important, and a little bit different than just interviewing an adult. Another one I think of, sorry, don't mean to dominate it all, is there's some really good research showing that leading questions can really influence the information you get from a child. And so you have to be really careful to not lead them suggest answers implicitly in your questions, or you will get relatively invalid data, or you might get an invalid interview anyways. So being particularly cautious, especially when there's a lot of distress, that they may say yes to whatever question you ask them.
I'm a big believer in having a parent either side by side or in the room while doing an interview with the child. And I'll never do an interview with a kid standing up. I'll always be on my knees or sitting down or at eye level or below with the kids. Flashback to school when you got called to the principal's office, you know, and you were sitting down and somebody was towering over you, telling you what you did wrong. It doesn't work. It's not an effective means of interviewing a kid. Eye to eye, same level, easy going, and listen rather than talk.
You touched on this a little bit earlier, David, about competition and how there's the pressure as reporters to beat the competition. What are some things that, from an ethical perspective, that you think students should know how to keep their job? How do they keep their job as a reporter? And what are some guidelines that they should follow?
I think it's a juggling act every single day, and that self-assessment on the drive home after work, usually in my head goes, did I treat everybody fairly? Was I honest with all of my subjects? Did I listen to them respectfully? And I think if those three goals were met, then I did a very fair job in covering the story that day. I think we have a real responsibility to our readers and to our subjects along with our employer. And balancing all three masters, so to speak, is very important.
So this leads into kind of at the end of our covering trauma specifically. How do you prevent re-traumatizing a person when you talk to them, when you approach them and getting them to give you information for your story? How do you not re-traumatize someone?
Not the experts.
I think informed consent again comes up. Some people want to talk about it, and talking about it can be very, very healthy. But as we said, everybody responds a little bit differently, and so some people may not want to talk about it, and I think we need to be respectful of that decision, especially in the immediate aftermath. They may be dissociated, numb, angry, trying to avoid it. I think avoiding thinking about these things can be a problem in the long run, but in the short term, it might be the most healthy thing this person can do. And making sure they know what you're going to ask and respecting their decision to not talk about it is really important.
And I think recognizing when to stop, when to turn it off, when to say, it's not worth getting the story. I was interviewing a woman and we were talking about her getting a job. She was doing really well, really making progress towards exiting the sex trade. Great conversation. Within maybe a minute, all of a sudden she digressed into talking about having HIV, being sexually assaulted by a relative, and I mean it went quick from celebration to I've now had this traumatic flashback and I am essentially melting down and crying uncontrollably. And as a researcher, it's a little similar to journalism. You want to get the data, right? You want to be able to tell their story. But I said, I just turned it off. No more questions. And I spent some time consoling that person, being empathetic, because at that time, her health and wellness was so much more important than my job or any information I could get. So knowing when to turn it off, not pushing people for information when you can see that they're having a really visceral reaction, I think is really important. Just knowing when to draw that line and set healthy boundaries.
That's a good point. Sometimes they may be aware enough to tell you they don't want to talk about it. Sometimes it might be more implicit, and being sensitive to that is so important. You ask a question about the event, and pretty soon you're talking about something else. Okay, well, what about the event? Now you're talking about something else again.
Yeah.
And people might try to use that strategy intentionally or not, to not have to process it right then and there. And that's a sign that I think we can be sensitive to.
We mentioned earlier, we touched a little bit on how personal experiences affect reporting. Why is it important to understand how trauma looks different for everyone?
Because two people can be in an event, a traumatic event, and they will have different reactions. They will see things differently. So I think it's just that differences that we all have that is important to acknowledge.
And I think it orients you to collecting data each and every time you're interviewing someone, paying attention, being sensitive to what's going on right now for this person. With mental health, which this falls in that broad area, there is no blueprint. We have to go in and be sensitive each time because everybody differs. And so I think recognizing those differences is important to orient people to collect their own data each and every time.
We talk a lot in class, we discuss ethics on your personal code of ethics. What does it mean to have a personal code of ethics, especially as a journalist? What does that mean?
Well, as the journalist up here, I guess,
Yes, sir.
I'm
Yes,
feeling a lot of people looking at me. As I said earlier, I think going home and saying, did I do no harm? On the way home at the end of the day, did I do no harm? Did I bring a fair story to my readers? Did I do a good job for my employer? Did I treat my subject with respect? For me, that's the big trilogy. That's my personal ethics statement. It's interesting, in my first class in photojournalism, every semester, I ask my students to develop a personal mission statement regarding their ethics. And then I give it back to them at the last class and say, how has this changed? I think it's always good to sit down and jot something down and reevaluate it on a regular basis.
Well, we now can open up questions to the audience. If you have any questions, please stand. Yes, Professor Foley?
As a reporter, I remember one particular case that was different from all others, one particular story, where I knew the victim of a terrible accident. And that one affected me more deeply than all the other awful wrecks I've covered, murders I'd covered. And a few years ago, one of our graduates was a reporter in Little Rock, and her best friend at the station had been murdered. And she told me that you have no idea how difficult it is to cover the murder of your best friend. Most stories that journalists cover, you don't know the people involved. So talk a little bit about how you might cope with covering the rare story where you really do know the folks involved.
In a larger market, I think you're less apt to cross paths with people who you know. But the reality is, I live in a small town in North Jersey, just outside of New York City, and my son's on a volunteer on the ambulance, and he's always taking neighbors and friends and people from our community that he knows, and his focus is on helping them to the best of their ability and then coming home and taking a deep breath. And I think that would work for journalists also. We want to tell a fair story. I will never cover a news job in my town. I just won't do it. I know the cops, I know the ambulance people, I know the volunteer firefighters, and it's too close for me. Okay? So I have a 2 square mile do not fly zone. That committing journalism in my hometown just isn't happening. But the reality is, even if you're working in Fayetteville, you're going to run into the same cops and the same rescue workers all the time. Chances are, you had a news story on campus here the other day with the power outage. And I think there was a gas leak a couple of weeks ago also. I think you have to separate yourself from the fact that you're part of the community, but you also have to be respectful that you are covering your community. It's you're straddling a difficult position. It's really not easy. In Michigan a few years ago, there were riots after Lansing won some college championship, I believe in basketball. And one of my friends was a student there at the time, was taking pictures of people setting fires to cars and overturning police cars and stuff like that. And he was later in a position where the cops had subpoenaed all his images. They were using his photos to try to identify and convict people of serious crimes. And he personally felt afraid that he'd be singled out. This is the guy with the camera that got our fraternity brother indicted. So, walking that, it's a strange position to walk in. Realizing that you have a larger good to serve, but also you're part of the community that you're covering. It's not an easy place to be in.
As a journalist or a social worker, is it hard to come forward and say that you have PTSD because you had to listen to someone talk about getting sexually assaulted? And is there a sense of feeling like you don't have a right to it, or you didn't pull anybody out of that fire, so why do you, is it hard to come forward, and is there a fear of somebody going, well, you were just watching, why are you upset about it? All I did was tell you about it, so why do you get to be upset?
April, did you feel that way as you mentioned interviewing victims?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. And I think I feel thankful that I'm in a field where those conversations are normal and validated. But I think I did have I felt a little bit of guilt, right? Where I'm listening to these women's stories. They're telling me of all these challenges they're experiencing trying to exit, how there's no supportive services for them, how every day they worried about being killed on the street, how their interactions with law enforcement are not like they should be, that often they're assaulted, harassed, raped by law enforcement. And I'm a social worker and I'm listening to this. And I think the most guilt I felt is that I couldn't do anything physically about it. My job as a researcher was to collect this information, tell their story, much like a journalist would, in hopes that I could continue to influence social change. But at the end of the day, when I was done talking to them, I had to know that they would be back on the track, selling themselves. And to add another layer of complexity, actually, when I was interviewing these women, there was a serial killer targeting women in the sex trade in Kansas City. So I found myself watching the news and being just really worried that I was going to come back the next day and find out that one of them was dead. So I think most of my guilt comes from not being able to make an immediate change for that person. But I have to be able to take a step back and see the bigger picture and see how I'm going to move forward with my research and my work as a social worker to make a difference in their lives. Because if no one tells their story, nothing's going to change. But in terms of being able to express when I'm struggling or when I feel like I need help, that's really understood in social work. And I feel very comfortable seeking help or letting people know that this has been really difficult for me. And I think folks understand that in my field because we come from a culture where we get that journalism might be different. I'm not sure how that would
Yeah,
look.
very much so.
Yeah.
I need to go back to the newsroom post 9/11, and one of my coworkers, wonderful guy, big, hulking, strong gentleman, and routinely you find him crying in the back of the office, like in a room where mostly the photographers would come in, hang out, and wait for an assignment. And Bud wound up having a stroke about 3 months after 9/11. I think a lot of it was unresolved trauma from his time in Vietnam as a soldier, added to the trauma of being all of a sudden being attacked in your own city where you felt safe, and all of a sudden that safety net was pulled out from underneath him. And another co-worker who stopped their car in the middle of a bridge as an airplane flew over on final approach to LaGuardia. Of course, hearing the sound of the airplane reminded them of the sound of the airplane the morning of September 11th. And I wrestled, and I continue to wrestle with a bunch of little 9/11 gremlins myself. What's different between my experience and that of my coworkers is I had a physical injury, okay? And it was very easy to say, oh, David Hanchu was hurt on 9/11. I would suggest that there were many, many residents of New York and many journalists, many photographers, and many people who witnessed that day that were hurt but didn't have the physical scars to go along with it. And we hold, you're not broken if there's nothing broken. So I think people who are hurting emotionally need to realize that, yeah, they are victims and survivors and are entitled to seek treatment the same way you would from asthma or a broken bone or from any other injury of that day. Unfortunately, the newsroom is not equipped to deal with that. Look, here's the reality of the situation. The majority of you will be freelance reporters, freelance photographers. You're going to be responsible for taking care of your own health care. And if you're lucky enough to wind up in a staff position, many employers offer employee assistance programs. That's a great thing, but they do a great thing dealing with traditional family trauma. This kind of stuff is way out of the norm. So, being able to know where the resources are to take care of yourself and your peers is crucial.
The common thing I hear from students is, oh, I'm just going to be a sports reporter, or I just want to do entertainment. I think I want to cover fashion. I don't ever want to cover news. How is something you and we discussed previously was that on 9/11, and it was in the middle of Fashion Week, and that you saw fashion reporters dressed to the nine, running and covering this terrible event. Touch on that if you would.
Absolutely. Yeah, again, we're talking about the most traumatic of traumatic stories, not the daily journalism, which is bad enough. But it was Fashion Week in New York. There were lots of people to see beautiful clothes on runways, and were wearing high heels and were dressed fashionably to cover them, who wound up running or taking trains or taxis or walking down to the World Trade Center to cover a breaking news event. So because you're only in features, or you're only in fashion, or because you're only a sports reporter, a story like that, it's all hands on deck. And everybody's going to be involved. So don't discount the idea that you're going to be involved in real news coverage, even if you're only covering celebrity hairdressing for the website. Okay? It's all hands on deck. Everybody's going to wind up working.
I had something happen when I was in my mid-20s and reporting for a daily newspaper. And it was only today that I recognized it as trauma. My beat was courts. And I, of course, had seen the gruesome pictures and heard the sad stories and everything. But this was in the 70s when this was common, but there was a big drug bust. 38 people were arrested. 7 of them stood up to go to court. That's how broadly the arrests were made. And one guy who did go to trial, he was found with a gram of marijuana Now, some of you may know that's the weight of a paperclip. That's nothing. He got a year in the county jail, and I had just reported another guy who had shot and killed his brother, shot him in the back, and he got 2 years probation. And this went on, this particular term of the court went on for about a month, I guess. And it was just over and over and over again, all of this miscarriage of justice. And when it was over, I got out of journalism for 2 years. It rocked me so deeply to my core that this type of injustice, and like I say, I don't think until today that I realized that was trauma. And I thought I was going to freelance. I did nothing. I stayed home and did nothing. And I just wanted to bring that up to say that trauma, to broaden the idea of trauma even more. I didn't see anybody hurt. I wasn't hurt directly myself, but it emotionally affected me so deeply.
I think it's a great point. We've been talking about trauma from the perspective of our diagnostic manual, which kind of tries to limit, for purposes of diagnoses, what we're labeling trauma. But events that can really impact us in significant ways go well beyond that. And a lot of these sort of symptoms or responses we're talking about apply equally as well in those situations as they do in these situations that might be a little bit more commonly linked to PTSD. It's a good point.
So I'm taking another social working class, and Elizabeth Ross has 5 stages of loss and grief being, so you kind of initially, the idea is that you would go on in a linear fashion from, denial to anger to then bargaining, followed by depression, and then finally acceptance. And listening to you guys talk about trauma and maybe dealing with some of the victims of that, I just couldn't help but maybe draw a connection in my mind to that. Do you think that as a journalist, having knowledge of psychological things like that or social working things help you as a journalist maybe when you're interviewing people, or do you find that you use things like that often? Or
Probably not with the same 5 categorizations. We probably not even break down 5 categorizations, but realize that this person is really hurting, really in denial, or really messed up is probably how we would put it. Sorry.
so sensitive.
Well, I could have used other terms. It's really interesting. Look, we very often get pushed into coverage about things that we know nothing about. And I think we're doing everybody a disservice by not at least Googling the subject. Okay? You don't go into an interview. I don't cover a lot of sports. Every once in a while I get to cover the Giants or something. And I'll Google the New York Giants just to see who the big names are to make sure I don't miss them when I'm photographing them. We don't go into any kind of assignment unprepared. So at least having the most basic of knowledge on whatever we have to go cover. I think we could ask better questions. I think we could identify the right people to ask those questions of. I think we could tell better stories. If we just have the littlest bit of knowledge and information when going into any kind of story. So, knowing how to talk with somebody, to interview somebody, I think it's great that we're having the discussion today. I've learned a lot from this panel.
I'll add one thing. Sometimes knowledge is good because you learn what you don't know. When I covered Columbine, I had the year before, and it was less than a year, just got my master's degree in clinical psychology, okay? And so I learned diagnostic interviewing techniques. I actually had a practicum where I worked with a client. I did any number of things that you teach people to interview people in a kind of controlled setting. And, then there I was interviewing basically a scrum of people in various states. And if the people at the OSU homecoming game I'm sure experience the same thing, which is you'll have people who are completely hysterical. You'll have people who is cool as ice, and all sorts of states in between. What I knew going into that was that didn't tell me anything about the degree of trauma they had suffered. And that's important. The other thing that, and I can't say, in hindsight, it looks like I had some sort of method, but in fact, I was just another reporter on the scene. But when Matt talks about getting consent and disclosure, a lot of the things that I did as a reporter, particularly at those scenes when we're talking about masses of people at Columbine, we're all waiting at a school public building setting where parents are waiting, school buses arrive with the students who have been in that school, the parents kind of half knowing whether their kids were alive, the kids getting off the bus, and then the parents go, the kids go, the media goes, right? I played rugby. It is a scrum. You almost really have to dive into there. But little things like when you have a notebook, okay, what I would always do, and I did it because I just wanted to get names right, but write the name on a notebook. And I wouldn't put it in their face, but I would say, is that all right? It's just another visual cue that we've just had an interview, okay? So knowing what you don't know is really important, and it should help guide you, but what you don't want to do is fall into the kind of cliches that people kind of use when they're describing traumatized people. You're basically kind of an open vessel. You want to be sensitive to what's going on, but you understand that there's a lot that we don't know, and even the folks at this table don't know. And if you start there, if this makes any sense, you know a whole lot more than pretty much anyone.
I would add that knowing things about how a person recovers from grief, from trauma, is important for monitoring your own reactions too. It's important for understanding who you're interviewing, but also for keeping track of how you're doing after event like this. And that's why I kind of wanted to emphasize earlier that most of us are going to experience a lot of the symptoms of PTSD right afterwards. That doesn't mean we have PTSD. Most of us recover just fine. Knowing that, I think, can be helpful in identifying when maybe you want to do a little bit more to recover.
Any other questions?
Have you ever found that going through a traumatic event has affected your ability to objectively report on that event? Like, someone's gone to do the story. Not everyone can just claim, oh, I feel really traumatized in the situation, I can't write it. Someone has to write it. So if you've experienced a traumatic event or been at the scene of one or been through that second-hand trauma, how do you deal with still objectively writing that story and meeting your own personal feelings about that situation after you get the truth out there?
I think if it becomes a little overwhelming, I've written a couple of stories on 9/11, but I felt it much easier to have a reporter who asked me questions that I answered and basically helped me write the story. That worked for me. I'm not saying that would work for everybody, but it almost helps to step outside of yourself that way.
You have something you want to add? If you'd like to help you.
Well, what I would add is when we talk in my ethics class about covering traumatic events, I always start with one part of the SBJ ethics code that came up on the last exam, so I'm not trying to re-traumatize you guys. but it's independence, okay? It's not one of the things we think about a lot. We're always thinking about seeking the truth and reporting it and minimizing the harm and then accountability and transparency, but independence, so that usually we go, well, you know, nobody's paying me any money to endorse products, so I'm pretty good there, and I don't know the police chief, or I'm not having a relationship with somebody on the school board, right? So we go through that checklist, but what I say is, independence means checking in. Is there something about this event or which you're covering? Does it have a personal resonance? Is it triggering something? And when I say this in class, and David will understand this, and this is part of what having a personal ethics code is all about, newsrooms are not friendly places for people who, when you know something big is happening, somebody steps forward, I don't think I can, you know, report on this. But it's up to you to kind of change the culture, because there may be things that are it's not good for you to cover. And the one final thing I'll say is, you know, as researchers, one of the flaws in a lot of research, and it's just really hard to we do our best to kind of get a beat on this, but you're not blank slates. Nobody in this room is a blank slate. The odds are that out there, we have people who have suffered trauma, been through traumatic events. And as a reporter, they get triggered by events. It's something we don't talk about, but it's something we need to start talking about. So having that personal ethics code is important, because you're right. Ali was correct in answering that question. It is going to affect your coverage, and you need to be aware of that.
There's been a lot more awareness of trauma and PTSD since the recent wars, recent 15 years. And I wondered, maybe Ray and David could talk, do you think that assigning editors are more aware of how that kind of effect can exist for photographers and reporters? I mean, you think about back in the 50s, go out and cover it, be a man, whatever. Do you think there's more, thinking about that these days?
I think editors are trying to do more with fewer people, less resources, less money, less time, tighter deadlines, the internet with the constant deadlines. Saying that, one of the most interesting post 9/11 reactions I remember was from this complete and total hard-ass editor who was about the least concerned about what you thought anybody I've ever met in journalism, who had a light bulb on moment about a month after 9/11. He said, I was sending people down to cover a story that might have gotten them killed, and for the first time I stopped and wondered if I was doing the right thing. But that was the extent of his that was about as warm and fuzzy as he ever got. Okay, we deal with all kinds of different people, all kinds of different situations. I think as a manager, you have to make those tough decisions sometimes. I think that it might not have been the perfect thing, but what he had to do to get a story covered. So I think if you want warm and fuzzy, it's not the business to go into.
And what I'll add, and then I'll kind of wrap up here, I thank our panelists. I mean, the problem is that, the editors we work for and became are products of the same dysfunctional system, that kind of perpetuates these things. There are improvements, there are people who are aware, but the problem is we have folks who learned themselves not to talk about things, and they learned a certain code, which invariably is, described as the macho code. But kind of to round up, our next event here, which will be a media workshop that we'll be posting, and hopefully everybody will come, will be about that very subject. We're going to have Joe Haidt, who was the editor of the Daily he was an editor, a top editor at the Daily Oklahoman during the Oklahoma City bombing, who kind of basically became aware of, on the fly, just as David did, boy, we have to address this because this is unlike anything we've known. We'll also have a top station manager at the Roanoke, Virginia TV station, where a reporter and a photographer were gunned down on the air this year. And they had to, again, deal with that on the fly. So whatever progress we have in the news industry is due to people who have just realized this ain't working. And we have to do something right now. So I think that's the next major issue that we're going to try to address with a panel discussion. So I guess this is the point where I just want to thank everybody in the audience for a wonderful discussion.